Live from the New Scientist Labs, it's Janine Young with Wammo on Kiwi.
New Scientist Laboratories in Melbourne City. Janine Young, she's just finishing up her breakfast in the lab this morning. I hope you don't get that anything cross-contamination between experiments and breakfast.
You're actually not meant to eat in labs, so I'll just admit that I'm actually sitting in my lounge room.
Fair enough. First up, a bit of a conservation story, really, about the tigers of the sea. What are the tigers of the sea?
Tuna. Tuna are actually big fish, and I must admit that you don't really think about it so much when it's sitting there in your sushi or your little sashimi, which I prefer salmon myself, I must say, but tuna is incredibly popular, and some of the best tuna in the world. Places like Nobu, a very swanky Japanese restaurant in London, you can pay up to £8 for a single piece of tuna sashimi. Extraordinary. And chances are that piece of tuna actually came from the fish market in Tokyo. Well, yeah, most of the tuna that's caught in the world does go to Japan. Some staggering numbers. A 70-kilo fish can be worth $15,000, which would be probably 16.5 in Kiwi dollars. The Japanese trade is estimated to be worth about $7 billion a year. In 2007, the official catch was listed as a bit over 23,000 tons, which is a lot, but the international body that regulates this is saying it's probably closer to 47,500 tons.
Right.
These numbers are huge, but unfortunately, the populations, particularly in the Mediterranean, can't sustain this. We're overfishing them to the point where they're likely to collapse.
Have you seen what they do in the Mediterranean?
Long line fishing, you mean?
No, well, that, but also they send planes out. They send spotters.
Which is actually cheating.
Yeah.
It's illegal.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be able to do that kind of thing, but they do. There's a researcher that this article is following with WWF who's trying to tag these fish because they know that there's two types. There's the ones that spawn in the eastern Mediterranean, and there's also one that spawns in the west, in the Gulf of Mexico. And what they do in between is a bit of a mystery. They don't actually know where they go or what they do, but they do know at the moment that the breeding population is about a third of that needed to sustain the population, but they're catching 3 times as many than is sustainable. So they reckon that within 3 years it's possible that the population could collapse. And this story is looking at some of the conservation efforts that WWF is up to try and work out just how many fish there actually are, where they're going, basically trying to get information about it because it's a bit of a black hole, a bit of a black box at the moment.
Yeah, but when there's so much money involved, it's really hard to slow down the trade, isn't it?
Absolutely, and the fear is that if it does for any reason become regulated or shut down, and Monaco is attempting at the moment to get CITES, the international treaty banning trade in endangered species, they're trying to get tuna listed along with things like, tigers, pandas, rhinos, to try and stop the trade.
But because they're in the ocean, because they're in the sea and we don't see them, they don't have the same kind of emotional effect, do they?
And they're fish. You can't pat a fish.
Yeah.
They're only good for eating. A lot of people don't find fish cute and cuddly, so, not that big a deal anyway. But the problem is that, first of all, it's likely to drive the market underground. It's likely to become an even bigger black market than it is at the moment.
Yeah.
But then you also start thinking about food chains. As soon as you take out the top predator, then it starts having implications as you go further and further down the chain. And, this is a fish stock that's been fished for 3,000 years. The Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, all of them were able to live in harmony, if you like, with the tuna.
Yeah.
But it would appear that we're just incapable of doing that, and that we're likely to fish them to extinction if we're not really careful.
Yeah, and the ocean will turn into a jellyfish soup.
Well, that's the thing, as I was saying, it has implications for the rest of the food chain. And, people don't, I think, understand how important these linkages are, and that ecosystems aren't called that for nothing, and the word eco is not there for fun. Ecosystems actually have very intricate links between the different species, and they've evolved together, which means that they've actually got very delicate balances, and as soon as you knock one out, it has implications for other populations rising, which means that, other things get over-predated. It's not good. And aside from that, losing a really massive species, a really iconic species, is never a good thing.
Yeah. And people also don't realise that, yeah, sure, there are healthy properties to tuna fish, but also it's kind of the worst fish to eat because they are at the top of the food chain, and the top predator. They've got the highest amounts of mercury.
That's true. I don't know what the levels are like in the Mediterranean, but certainly parts of the Mediterranean are going to be a bit murky. But you're right, fish do accumulate things like chromium and mercury. I remember a scare about it probably about 10 years ago, and they were saying, don't eat fish. And I'm not that big on fish to start with, so that didn't bother me a great deal, but you're right. People were actually getting quite ill because they were eating their 3 serves of fish a week, as we're being told to do.
Yeah.
And they, too, were accumulating some of these they're not hard chemicals, what do I mean? They're heavy elements.
I fancy sardines and anchovies and like. Down the bottom of the food chain.
There was a set of sardines that used to be in a tin made by one of the manufacturers, and they've taken it away, and I'm not happy.
Where did it come from? Was it Spanish sardine or...?
I'm ashamed to say I never looked.
Yeah.
I'm very ashamed. But sardines, when you mush them up with a bit of tomato and a toasted sandwich...
Good times.
Tasty.
Some people either love them or hate them, eh? Some people hate the sardines. Oh, they can't think of anything worse. I love it.
I think they're an acquired taste. You
Yeah.
change as you get older. But
Yeah.
I'm getting into salty stuff as I get older. So.
Yeah.
Okay, back off a cooking session and back onto science.
Yeah, well, kind of, in some ways, but back onto smelling now, actually, and how smells that when you first smell something, it kind of forms your impression of it for the rest of your life.
Smell is an incredibly sensitive sense. I think most people would know about that. You can smell something and it can, mentally transport you back to a time or a particular situation. It's a very evocative sense. And there's some researchers in Israel that have been trying to work out how these smells are laid down and what that has to do with the experience you were going through at the time. And specifically, they were looking at the first time you encounter something. So what they did, is they took a bunch of volunteers and showed them an object such as maybe a chair or a pencil was unlikely to be associated with a smell. It's not very often that a pencil evokes anything particularly sensitive. But
they do when you sharpen them. Remember the old sharpeners, pencil sharpeners at school?
Yes, the grinding ones?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember them.
And there's always a smell that came from it. It's a woody kind of...
Oh, I don't remember that. Yeah, maybe we just had really dodgy pencils.
Yeah.
They weren't actually made from wood. But they exposed these volunteers to a sound or to an odour at the same time. And an hour and a half later, they showed them the same object with a different odour or sound. And a week after that, they showed the volunteers the object again and asked them which odour or sound they associated with it. And they were also put in a functional an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging machine. And it's interesting because the volunteers were more likely to mention the first odour. And when they did, their brains had a particular type of activity in the hippocampus, which is a very ancient part of the brain. And that didn't appear if volunteers went for the second odour or if they'd been exposed to sounds. So this would suggest that this activity, the specific pattern in the hippocampus, is indicating that memories representing the first time we've been associating a smell with a particular thing. And that can have evolutionary sort of roots in the fact that we have to learn about our environment. So if we learn as a child that, say, rotting meat smells really bad, don't eat it,
yes,
then that can be a very strong and a very important association to mean that, frankly, we don't kill ourselves.
And we know that. That's not learnt, is it? We know that's already in us.
A lot of those sorts of instincts are, yes. The learning of these sorts of things builds on that. And it means that we actually have a very powerful way of being able to get through the world. As highly intelligent beings such as we are, you do need all these extra aids, but being able to put two and two together on top of instinct is really very powerful.
I like the thought of hanging out in my hippocampus, It seems to be a good part of the brain.
It's a very important part of the brain. In fact, what can you say? It's all important, but the way it all works together and the critical bits. I mean, we talk about stuff about the brain on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah.
We're fairly brain-based people, and I'm constantly amazed by what people are still learning because we still don't know that much about it.
I might start incorporating that into greetings. How's your hippocampus today?
I think you just like the word.
My hippo what?
I think you just like the word.
Yeah, I do like the word. You're right.
I like the word corticosteroid, but I'm
What's
I'm
that?
mad. A Corticosteroids are actually a natural part of your immune system that help damp immune systems down, but people with asthma also have corticosteroids. People who get shocking hay fever like I do, and I'm suffering this week, so I'm moaning to everybody who'll listen. It's also very important for being able to shut down allergy-type responses. So it's natural, but it's also used to treat issues with things like asthma and allergies and the like.
This episode of New Scientist brought to you by the Hippocampus and the corticosteroid. Thanks, Janine.
My pleasure.
Those stories you'll find in New Scientist magazine coming out next week.